So I'll start by giving a short introduction to what I think of as agency and how we research it. And the two girls you saw in the background before, my girls, and they've been sick for the last week, so I'm completely sleep deprived. So if I'm rambling or incoherent or anything like that, please let me know, ask questions. Yeah. Stop talking at some point. Yeah, please let me know and ask questions along the way. So the outline of my talk is like this. So I'm going to talk a bit about what I think agency is, and define it, some of the things we do when we investigate agency, some of the pitfalls, some of the habits, some of the good stuff, and lastly I'll try to explain a bit about how people explain agency, so what are main theories of agency. So first, agency. What is it actually we're talking about? An agency is a strange concept in many ways. So we have internal goals, we want to do actions. It's also about affecting the world. So we push a button to turn on a lamp and we measure this effect. So there's a lot of different elements in. This is of course a very, very simple action. Just pushing a button is not that hard. We rarely have problems doing it. But agency can also come about in more complicated areas, such as skateboarding, as this fellow is doing. And it also illustrates nicely that we can use objects and take this in as part of our actions. A good question and an interesting question about agency is something like this. Does this actually have agency? So this is a vacuum cleaner. It's a robotic vacuum cleaner. You press the button in the middle and it starts vacuuming the room. Now if I do it, pick up the vacuum cleaner, I might do it a bit randomly, not as random as that fellow. And I would definitely talk about agency in this sense. That would be an agent of my actions. But is this actually an agent? An interesting question. That's something I'll return to a bit. So a bit more formal definition of agency compared to what I've been talking about. So this is taken from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the first line of the agency entry. And it says, an agent is a being with the capacity to act. And agency denotes the exercise or manifestation of this capacity. But I would argue this is a very philosophical definition, and it's not really what we are after in our common sense when we're talking about agency. So that we can find something that can act, and agency denotes this exercise. Well, we can say that about the robot cleaner. It definitely acts. It does actions, and so it manifests this capacity. But it's not really what we are after when we're talking about agency. Well, I think about agency more as a consciousness thing. This is often referred to as sense of agency. So here's a quote by Patrick Haggett saying that sense of agency refers to the feeling that we are in control of our actions and of their effects on the external world. Put another way, I feel that my voluntary actions are caused by me and by my intentions. So this brings us a bit closer to what agency is, and the rest of the talk is basically about trying to understand the finer details in this quote. But it also brings us to the fact that agency is quite interdisciplinary in its roots. It definitely involves something about conscious experiences. This inherits a lot of problems we have in consciousness research, such as how do we actually get access to the data, the feeling of doing agency, this is the conscious experience. So how do we get access to this data? And we can use introspection, as we do a lot of time, to ask specifics, but it has some problems. It also involves something about actions, action selections. How do we decide to do a specific action? How do we bring it about? All these problems. Definitely something about motor control in there. How do we control our actions once we've decided on an action to do? And it also involves integrating the effects of our actions, so that is perceiving the world. So agency is a very broad sense of agency. I use the two simultaneously, as you mentioned. Not simultaneously, synonymously, sorry. So there's lots of different elements and lots of different ways we can investigate agency, and lots of different issues we try to get at when we're trying to explain agency. Now, most of the time our agency is really, really natural and straightforward to us. We don't think about it, we don't consider it. It's only when it really breaks down that or changes or unexpected things happen that we really think about it. I go into the lift, press the button to the fourth floor where my office is at, and I rarely think about it. I don't consider it. The interesting thing is that we know that agency breaks down, and in certain pathologies, such as schizophrenia, for instance, the patients report having unusual experience of agency. They, for instance, might feel they're being controlled by something else. They sometimes feel they control external events in the world which they do not control. Sometimes people report they're in control of the traffic lights, for instance, which they aren't. But they still have this subjective feeling of being in control, and this is a part of the pathology. Another case is anarchic hand syndrome, where patients do what we as outsiders would take to be intentional actions. It can be flicking on the light switch when you pass the light switch. It can be picking up food from a neighboring plate. So what we would see is as actions and what we could see other people do. The interesting thing is here that they claim that it's not them who did it. They know it's their arm, they know it's their body, but they were not the agent of it, they were not the reason for it. And we finally have a third case, which I have a hard time pronouncing, but this is basically patients who have suffered from a stroke or similar, and then have, for instance, a paralyzed arm, but they don't recognize the fact that they have a paralyzed arm. So when you ask them to move, for instance, they'll tell you they moved the arm. If you quiz them about the fact that it didn't move, they'll either come up with stories that tell you something like that, well, you didn't see it, or you didn't, or I didn't really want to do it, that's why. And it can be very hard, because it's a complete neglect of their own sickness and pathology. So we know that agency can break down, so it's not something naturally given in performing actions, it's something probably created later on or beforehand. So, and this is the reason. So agency, even though it seems very, very natural to us, is something that's being brought about. It's not given as a natural thing. But as you know, I've noticed I've actually talked about two different aspects of agency. One is what we can call the feeling of agency. This is the feeling of control I have when I act. So I know it's me. But another question is what we call judgment of agency. That is, am I the agent who's actually doing it? These two are highly connected, but it's often actually different questions. And we expect both to be explained by a proper feeling of agency. We both have this feeling of doing stuff, but we also have another knowledge called judgment of agency, which is this judgment that it's actually me who did it, it's not someone else. And a good example is when I click the light on a lamp and it turns on, I know I did it. If there is a delay, let's say 10 seconds I switch the light, the lamp actually doesn't go on, there's a 10-second delay, and then it comes on. Then I might actually feel completely in control of the action of turning on the lamp, but I might actually be a bit that, well, no, I was the cause of the lamp turning on. So this is kind of a way to cash out the difference between the two. So now we have a rough feeling of a muddy area of research, quite interdisciplinary. So the question, a natural follow-up question is, so how do we measure agency? What is it that we're measuring? An obvious choice when we're doing experimental agency is, of course, to ask the subject. We call these explicit measures of agency. And I've just picked one which I think is a good example of where you did this. Paper showing that priming can influence this sense of control. So another thing in agency research is you hear a lot of different concepts denoting the same phenomena. Some talk about agency, some talk about sense of control, some talk about sense of agency. So you'll see a bit different words in the titles of the paper. So. But here, the sense of control is referring to what I call the feeling of agency. So in this particular paradigm, which is a priming paradigm, classic, in some ways you have start by the fixation cross, you have a subliminal prime, fixation cross, and then they're instructed to move either left or right. So in the first row here, you have a coherent, congruent trial, where the prime and the mask and target, the prime and target at the same time, and you press the button as fast as you can, and then you get an effect. The colors are random and changed in every block. And after this, they, on a 8-point scale, actually should tell how much control did I feel of the event. So that is the color. Now the interesting thing is, and what this paper showed is that if you do it in a congruent trial, so the prime and the time are the same, people tend to feel more in control than when you're primed in one direction, but should actually move in another. So incongruent. So this tells us something about fluency being an issue when we have this feeling of control, or sense of agency. But it also shows a very nice issue that sometimes with explicit measures. Most of the time in non-pathological cases, people are quite aware and they're right about whether or not they did something. So when you ask them without any manipulation, they'll either say yes or no, or use the endpoints of a scale, say so either completely in control or completely not in control. So most of the time when people are using these explicit measures, they're doing some kind of manipulation. In this case, it's a priming experiment. And people sometimes quite persuasively argue that this makes explicit measures really hard to use, because you're doing something, because you're manipulated in some way. So it might not be the best way to measure agency. And this brings us to another way to ask questions. And this is implicit measure. And I think the absolute exemplar of this is a paper by Patrick Haggard on involuntary action and conscious awareness, where he first time mentions what is now known as intentional binding. I won't go that much into details of intentional binding, because I think we'll hear more about that later from Patrick. Definitely better than me. But the idea is something like this, very roughly, that you have a Libet clock. Don't know how many are familiar with the Libet experiment, but basically you have a clock face and you have a single clock hand rotating very, very fast. At some point, whenever people feel like it, they press a button and there is an event. In this case, it's a tone played very fastly afterwards, so 200, 250 milliseconds. And then they report either when they press the button or heard the tone. Now the interesting thing is, when you learn the relationship between the button press and the tone, you change your perception of when the tone is happening. So if you just ask them to judge when the tone is happening, they have a tendency to report it happened just a little after they actually heard the tone. Makes sense, you hear the tone, it has to be processed. And if you ask them when they hear the button press, when they press the button, they'll report it just a tiny bit before they actually press the button. Now when you learn the relationship between the button press and the tone, these switches. So you report hearing pressing the button a bit later than you actually did, and you report it hearing the tone a bit earlier than it actually did occur. And this shows us that this paradigm has been used in a lot of different ways now, and has been shown that the probability of the tone changes your perception of it. So it's very random whether or not there'll be a tone. You don't feel as much control over it, so your shift of when you heard it won't be that as great as when it comes every time. So this is a way to measure agency implicitly. We're actually not asking them whether or not they're in control, but we're asking them how the perception of an event changes. So based on the fact that they have an agency experience and they are in control, this changes our perception of the world. So this is what we measure in implicit measures. So the next question that comes around when we're doing this is that we often try to talk about either when something happens or what happened. Having both completely free time and completely free content is making it very, very hard to analyze the data. So we usually clip the experiments to look either at the temporal elements, so that when there's something happening, so they only have, for instance, one button they can press, they can't press two, or what's happening, so we try to manipulate the content of their intentions or their actions. So a classic example of this self-paced when action is the Libet task, where people wait for bit, and intentional binding also. People wait, whenever they feel like it, they press, so they're kind of in charge of when an action ought to occur. Another thing, this is a schematic from one of my own designs, is if you want to manipulate the content in some way, for instance, such as using TMS, you can't wait forever for people. We don't know when people are going to act. That way we can't really manipulate when they're acting. So just want to deliver TMS to a certain area at a specific time. For that kind, we use what you can call ready, steady, go paradigm. So you give them a fixation cross, you Then the first tone is like, get ready now, something's about to happen. The second is steady, and on the third we'd like them to move. So in this particular experiment they had to move either the left or the right index finger. They decided which one, and we would deliver TMS to either the left or the right motor cortex at the same time to compare voluntary and involuntary action. This of course takes some of the this takes some of the free will out of it, and people are limited in a way. So there's different trade-offs between different paradigms, and you can see this in papers, but it's good to keep in mind what it is.
So sometimes they decided themselves to act, and sometimes you just delivered the TMS, or you combined the two?
In this one I combined the two. They should always act, and there was always TMS. Sometimes it would be TMS to the same finger as the one removed, and sometimes it would be incongruent, so they twitched one and moved it. But this was just to give an example of how and when it can be relevant to restrict the timing of the movements. So this brings me to the last part. So we know an agency involves way different elements, like feeling and judgment. But how do we actually explain these? So how do we explain something like agency? And most theories can be categorized as either predictive, that is the predictive theories in the sense that they emphasize the predictive information going on mostly before an action is executed to generate the sense of agency. And other theories are more can be categorized as constructive theories, that is, it's not as much what happened before the action, it's how you interpret the action and you kind of reconstruct the sense of agency based on that. So the first is the comparator model, which is a predictive model. Most of you have heard this stress thing in the PMC sometimes. And they start with this. It's an old theory, but they were able to explain a quite interesting phenomena here, and this is that you can't tickle yourself. And that's quite odd. Most of the time people start trying to tickle themselves. I guess you heard it before. But yeah, you can't tickle yourself, and how do you explain that? And they argued that the reason we do this is that we have actually a motor system that predicts the outcome of our actions, and this is why we can't tickle ourselves, because the tickle issue is something is surprising for us. And when we predict the sensory consequences, this is actually not surprising. Furthermore, they argue that this model can actually explain some of the anomalies we find. Here they call them awareness of actions, but this is the feeling of agency as I've talked about it. And what they do here is, this is the most simple schematic you can find of this model. There are many way more complicated. So it's not the entire model, it's just a good way to show it off. So it starts by done. In the lower left corner you have a motor command. When you execute a motor command, that is you perform an action. This motor command is sent to the sensory motor system, which is then sent down the spinal cord and make you move. And this movement will then create some kind of sensoric feedback. Now the important part is that at the same time the motor command is sent to the sensory motor system, an efference copy, which is a copy of the motor command, is sent to a predictor model. So now this predictor model is trying to predict the actual predicted sensory feedback, which is then finally compared to the actual sensory feedback. So this is why we predict the feeling of tickling ourselves, and this is why it doesn't feel ticklish, because they kind of cancel out, and we know what's coming. So now a lot of people have argued this can actually explain some of the pathologies in agency and agency as such. And this is actually the fact that we predict what's going on, how we acted, and this matches with what actually happened, then we feel in control. So what goes wrong in, for instance, schizophrenia is that the prediction is off. The prediction is off. And archaic hand syndrome, there might not be a prediction made at all. And so this mechanism can describe some of the pathologies, and they argue that this is how we create our sense of agency, that is when our prediction matches our sensory motor system's actual feedback. Now, another way to try to describe agency has been proposed by Daniel Wegner. He calls his theory a theory of apparent mental causation. Wegner did, in a series of clever experiments, manipulate people into believing they did actions which they either were not in control of or could actually not do. Here, in the first picture, they're trying to, whenever the participant is told that there are two participants in the study and they should move around, and they'll be asked every now and then when they stop whether or not they're feeling any intentions of stopping on that particular. And then the other was actually a confederate trying to manipulate the results. And what they found was that there is a very, very strong relations between the thought of stopping on something and the timing, and when they actually stopped, in creating this feeling of agency. Furthermore, what he tried in the last experiment is they had a confederate who was actually acting at the hands. You had a participant who could only see the confederate's hand, and then and they were told different actions on the phone, for instance, wave your right hand, wave your left hand, and when they were congruent with what the other person were doing, they actually reported feeling more in control, despite the fact that they were not actually doing it. And Wegner even argues that some of his experiments show that people are willing to say they did actions which they could not physically have done. So he created this model to explain this. So the important part is we have an unconscious cause of a thought, we have an unconscious cause of an action, and we have some kind of unknown cause between them, or unconscious path between them. Now, the actual cause of thought is the unconscious cause, but parallel with that is an unconscious cause of action that's leading to an action in the left corner. So now, when the timing is right and the thoughts are matching the actions, we get this feeling of having an apparent causal path. So we have this feeling that our thoughts are actually causing the actions, but it's something completely different. And some interpret Wegner's theories to actually argue that what goes prior to the action doesn't really matter. If you really believe in a strong reconstruction, then we have a tendency to actually to reconstruct based on what's happening to us. So we don't have intentions, might not really be a thing, it might be a confabulation in our head. And so on. So the interesting thing, and these theories have often been pitted against each other, is the fact that they're asking very different questions. The first comparator model is asking questions about motor control, the feeling of agency, whereas Wegner is more interested in the question of whether I did it or not. So the question of judging agency. And they also come from, Wegner came more from social psychology than motor control sciences. But if I'm right in the conception and the clarification of agency that I laid out in the first place, both of these are actually elements in agency and something a model of agency should be able to explain. So the question is, how do you reconcile these two that's mostly incompatible in some essence? And this has brought up a range of new theories, often called integrative theories. One nice proposed, being proposed by James Moore, is based on Bayesian Q integration, as you find in the visual domain, where priors are weighted. Your expectations of what you see is weighted with data, and then you perceive something. And this fits very nice with a way to explain intentional binding, and some of the studies James Moore have done where they change the probability and show this statistical relationship there is between an action and an outcome, and argue that this can be explained by priors and give us a sense of agency. Now, this model, which I like very much, doesn't really tell us much about the relationship between feeling of agency and judgment of agency and all these other issues. I see this more as a very clever mechanism that's underlying this. It's not really as a full psychological theory of agency, if you will. So another group has proposed another model, and this is the most clean version of the and you can see there's all of a sudden a lot of things going into this model. Some of it they have a relationship between the feeling of agency and the judgments of agency in the middle. But it also has so much information that it's really, really hard to tease it apart. So you have background beliefs and knowledge about the world, you have information about the environment, which is definitely a part of experience of agency, because the world we're in actually limits our way to how we can act with it. So it definitely plays a role, but it also makes the model very, very muddy and very hard to interpret. So I think where we're at right now is that something like this is probably right, but now we're trying to tease apart all the different elements in it, trying to tease about how much does post-dictive information actually, that is reconstructive information, actually have an effect on the feeling of agency, and how much does it have an effect on the judgment of agency and action selection, as mentioned with the priming study and the efference copy. So I think this is where we're at. We might actually have a good idea of how we bring this about. Now we just need to tease apart all the elements. Yeah.
Could you maybe elaborate on the difference between the model from Chris Frith and the predictive coding model set forth by James Moore? They seem quite similar to me. And it's an early model that Chris uses in the paper that you use there, but aren't they basically in agreement?
I think the comparator model was not originally framed as predictive coding. I think that's come later on.
Yeah.
All Bayesian doesn't have to be predictive coding.
Sure.
I'm not sure James would actually argue his is predictive coding. Yeah, Patrick.
Could I comment? I think the Frith model commits to a lot of processes and a lot of signals, whereas what the Moore model is just doing is looking at the sources of information that might be relevant to judgments or experiences. It doesn't say anything about specific processing. So there's no real boxes and arrows in what Moore is saying.
Thanks.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, and that brings us to the end. So just to sum up, consciousness is a agency is a conscious experience about effects in the external world. So we usually subdivide this into feeling of agency and judgment of agency. That it can't break down in some cases, and we can manipulate it, it can be altered. And there's definitely elements of predicting and post-diction in it. But the truth to explain agency is probably in the integration of the predictive and post-dictive information. Thank you.
Any questions so far?
Cool.
Yes.
I don't know if this is the right time for a very general question.
Please.
I was just wondering, how does this sense of agency or awareness of control, I was just wondering how it relates to the sort of general tendency of humans to ascribe causality to, so it's not only a matter of what I would be able to do to the world, but just a general phenomenon that we tend to ascribe causality to, various things that has not so much to do with ourselves. I'm wondering if, because it seems somewhat similar.
Yeah, and I think they're highly connected. Now the question is which way the era of causality actually pointing this in. So is the reason we feel agency over so many things the fact that we describe causality even to events where there are no causality? This is what you see in schizophrenia, for instance. Or do we describe causality to things in the world because we feel agency. And I think a lot of agency is about this feeling of causality. This is that we can have an effect on the world. So I'm not sure it's actually different questions. I think it's just different ways of phrasing it. I have a background in philosophy, so I'm very wary about talking about causality. This is what we've been schooled through. I'm not sure it's a good idea. But so yeah, I really think about terms of causality, but I think you're absolutely right. And I think in essence it's the same question. But agency is also about what is needed for us to describe causality to an event pair? Like, why do I describe some kind of causality to the fact that my turning on the lamp makes the light bulb light up?
Thank you for a very nice overview, first of all, despite 2 signals. Hopefully they're well out. So can you elaborate a bit on which, I guess, feedback that the system uses? I've discussed this briefly with James Moore when he gave a presentation over here. So which feedback does the system typically uses when it goes sense of agency? For instance, how important are visual feedback compared to tactile?
So this is one of the features I really like about James Moore's spatial cue integration, is that it's weighted depending on the noise. So if you have a noise estimate, you can weigh some information more than others. So if you know you have a very clean tactile information looking for something in the dark, for instance, you might not weigh your visual inputs that high. However, if you're wearing like oven mittens and trying to locate the pen on the floor, you might rely very heavily on your visual. So I think it changes from situation to situation and what you're trying to establish. And I think this is one of the very nice features of the spatial cue integration mechanism, that it allows you to weigh different information, different kinds of feedback, both based on your priors, but also based on the noise in the information you get feedback from.
This about the feedback, reflective behavior or impulse or emotional cues are processed differently from more determined action. And I have a very elegant example from Yoko Ono, who made a box with a smile, a little box with an open lid. And most visitors at the museum, they looked at it and say, oh, that's not really nothing, and it passed by. But of course I was curious, and I looked inside the box, and there was this beautiful smile. It really got to my heart. Then I was like, wow, it's a mirror. Then I thought, wow, it must be my smile. This happened more than 20 years ago, but this kind of experience struck me as the mind is processing feedback and information at very various speed. And of course we have to modify the model so it's not totally complicated, but this feedback from, or this impulse from, like if a toddler is running towards the street, or something is falling, you can take strong action without determining anything, you just have to do it. Or the emotional feedback, sometimes I think it cues people to a lot of behavior without much awareness. So is that just bundled into this, you have this box with awareness that was not so aware? I think in the last big model from, what his proper name, yes, this one. No, yeah, of course back then, no, there was another one.
That one?
Yeah, unconscious cause of action. So that's all that bundled into that. The emotions and reflective behavior and impulse behavior.
I'm no expert on that model, to be honest. I can't, and I know even less about emotions, so I would find it very hard to put emotions into this model, to be honest. But this is why, of course, this model is very complicated, but it's also right because you actually have
Yeah.
emotional responses, and arousal, of course, plays a role in this somewhere, and emotions probably also do. But as you know, in sciences, we sometimes have to artificially cut down on our variables just to keep things the same, so we get something to compare. So if you complete, it could be interesting to see how emotions affect sense of agency, and I expect it to have a big impact. The question is just how to do it. Mark?
So, a question about, maybe related to your on the sensory modalities, but also on the types of behavior that we're looking at when we're studying agency. So, is there any reason why a lot of the experiments that we're doing with agency are something that cause a change in the surrounding, and we then have to evaluate our sense of agency according to the change in the environment, compared to the sense of agency that we have over our own movements, where not, I mean, of course it does change my view of my arm, that is a change to my surroundings, that I now can see my arm in somewhere in the vicinity of my visual space, but is it just a matter of weighing your different sensory modalities differently, and that when you're doing something which not necessarily causes a change in the surrounding to the same degree as when you're just moving yourself, and so, or maybe put it in another question, so is there a difference between the sense of agency of doing something external to the world compared to just moving? Do you have any notions on that, or any thoughts?
Well, my thoughts is that agency mostly is about affecting the world. There's definitely a self-knowledge of body movements, whether it's the same, whether they have the same underlying mechanisms. It seems reasonably to take a guess that some of the mechanisms that are creating feedback for a model of agency is also in fact used when you perceive your own body. But I can't give you any data to support that at the moment. We do the experiment.
I don't know if the culture here is to comment back, or whether everything goes through there.
No, not at all. It's usually, the idea is to have a discussion. So
From the point of view of the brain, the body is part of the external world.
Yeah.
It seems really funny to think that way,
Yeah.
but it must be true, I think, intuitively.
Yeah.
So,
But the brain
the first thing that the brain needs to learn to control, the first bit of the external environment that the brain needs to learn to control, is the musculature of the body.
Yeah.
And somehow, with the familiarity and skill that we acquire, we come to think that our body is part of us. Whereas if you take the perspective from the brain, at least initially, the body must be an external object, like the external world. It becomes not part of the external world, but initially it must be.
Sorry, why is that necessarily the case?
Well, if you think
Your
about
brain's
it,
part of your body,
if you think about it,
and you have the unending connections between nerve and sensory perceptions, and there's not some break between your brain and your fingertips.
if you think about the, I see your point. If you think about the idea of a signal, a command signal, which is sent from a controller to some sort of what engineers call a plant, something which actually executes the command.
Yeah, no, I understand the theory, I just disagree with it, that was all.
Well, I think that's great.
But you can also see, so when people are using objects such as a cane, they have a tendency to feel their personal space is actually extended. In the same
I
way.
mean, I would be more to believing that you are part of the external world rather than I kind of look at it the other way, and I think you can look at these things the other way. And something I was actually going to ask about the experiments, there seem to be a level of mediation of technology. So you don't ask people to pick up a pencil, you ask people to press a button which will then change something that's mediated by technology. And I just wondered what kind of effect that actually had.
Well, you can. So how do you define the technology in the sense is so you can make them connect to pieces of wire lighting up light bulb. That's technology. Is it the computers you're concerned about?
No, it's just that it's not a. It's because you're manipulating things in order to change the feedback, which obviously I understand is the point of doing it. You end up doing something with an element of a black box in there.
Yes.
And I just wondered how much that black box has an impact on this idea of agency.
Well, Matt, you can come first.
So I mean, I think it's exactly that point that I also wanted to emphasize that you sort of use this black box and you also need to gain some familiarity with that black box. So you need to know something about when you press a button, the light goes on. So in one place I used to work, there was this delay when you press the button, and I just felt completely awful every time I had to switch on or off the light because it just took forever to do it. I felt really unease with that. But you need to gain that familiarization with that, and because your body is in some way so integrated with your brain, or vice versa, that your brain is part of the body, then you have that familiarization already from birth without.
Yeah.
So your experience with that is completely different than when you put in this black box that is actually a piece of technology, I think.
But yeah, of course it's a piece of technology. The use of computers is also very pragmatic. We get reactions times.
No,
and I think that talking about integration into the environment, I think most people today are so comfortable using a computer. When you take undergrad psych students, they're not concerned about pressing a button. I don't think they feel it to be anything unnatural. So I'm not too worried about that, to be honest.
So if I could just follow quickly up on that, so I'm just curious, so all of these paradigms are about judging your feeling of control over external events, right? And I don't know the literature as you do, but are there any studies looking at the feeling of control over your movement? And all of these paradigms, people are moving, right, all the time, and they're not doubt about whether they're moving or they're moving themselves, or so that part is fixed, right? That doesn't change across conditions.
No.
So are there any studies looking at where you actually manipulate that?
Yeah, there's a lot. Mark, sitting next to you, has done quite a few.
Well,
but yeah, and Mark Chanot has done some very famous studies where they show that by giving people false feedback, having
that's still looking at an external effect or consequence, right? So that's looking at the.
It's hard even to look at your own body without seeing it as a consequence of your.
Yeah, but that's looking at a line on a computer screen, or it's just like listening to a sound, isn't it?
What are you imagining? It sounds like you have some non-external consequence.
Nowhere.
You're not talking about thoughts, are you?
No. So it's just so in the Chanron case, people are performing voluntary movements across all conditions, right? So I'm just wondering this question of I suppose the question was does it change anything to this this issue of feeling of agency, whether we're only looking at external events or whether we're looking at the bodily movements themselves? Was that the
Yeah.
And then I was just wondering whether there are any, maybe there are, I don't know, pragmatic complications that are such that you cannot really manipulate the movements themselves. I don't know, but if the movements are no different in nature from the other external events, then I suppose you should be able to. Then it is just a practical question, isn't it?
People have compared voluntary actions with passive movements. So people have done experiments where either you invite the participant to press the button, or you grab the participant's hands and you push it onto the button.
Yeah.
So there, the physical event in the physical displacements of the body are supposed to be matched.
Yeah.
But in one case, I mean, this is a Wittgenstein question.
Yeah.
What is left over if I subtract the
Yeah.
fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm?
Yeah.
And that people have done that sort of experiment.
Yeah.
But is that what you mean?
Maybe. So I suppose with the external events, right? You don't know from the outset whether this event is your action or not, right? And then you have to judge, was it mine or did I do it or didn't I do it? I suppose if someone could grasp my arm, that's not open for debate, right? In that sense, it's a bit different.
No, but you can.
Yeah. So it's a kind of simple question. If movements are really not different from, I don't know, the sound of a tone or whatever, and then we should be able to raise the same, in principle, at least the exact same type of questions with the body, the person moving his or her body, as with the sound of a tone, right? And then just asking, what type of paradigms would that be? I think grasping an arm is not going to work because there won't be any initial uncertainty as to whether it was mine or not.
No.
Do you have an answer to that?
I think it was an answer on a comment. Because I do think to this question, I think Mads actually provided some of the answers during this talk, that you have these like two traditions that traditionally have been pitched against one another in talking about this sense of agency, but I think the recent development is that maybe they're not actually talking about the same type of agency. So in, as I said, the sort of Bigner school, where they come from this social psychology manipulation using judgment of agency, whereas the motor control are more also control these implicit measures of agency. And I think that's basically the state of the field, that maybe we should start describing these different types of maybe different fields of agency as some kind of working up some kind of nomenclature, and I think that tool use is an open question, and different types of actions followed by different types of agency. I think most of the contrasts have been this voluntary, non-voluntary, because there was a lot of things to be sorted out in that contrast. But these kind of experiments, and I've done quite a few of them myself, usually consist of having people sitting in a dark room in the basement and pressing their key for like 300 times, which also can be criticized. This is not like the same type of agency as riding your bike downhill. It requires a lot more constant information integration, and watching out for pedestrians and all that. But I think that's basically an open, it's an empirical question to pursue.
Coming back to your question, so I don't know if I catch it right, but I was thinking about, and that also refers back to the direct relation that we are supposed to have from birth between brain and body, which I'm not quite sure about, in the sense that what happens if you actually manipulate your capability to move in a way that you are not really feeling anymore that your hand's doing something. Like, I remember when I studied medicine, I was put for 2 weeks in a cloth that would not allow me to use my wrist a lot to simulate being aged, right? And I had to spend 2 weeks with this, and it's in a hospital. And at the beginning, you really have the feeling that you have no control about what you're doing, right? Because it's not according to your predictions, right? So your normal habit is not there, and I guess that also due to that you're in childhood actually have to develop your motor capacities, right? And they're not right there from the very beginning. Though of course you have a connection to your limbs, but they're just not like responsive in a very predictable way. And I don't know if you've seen kids, that try to make a circle, and they're too small for doing that. They get really frustrated right at it, right? Like by seeing but I'm doing this, it's me, right? It's not working, things like that. So this might be a manipulation where you could look at it in that sense.
But is that not a different question? Because are you not saying there the child in that situation is fully aware of what they're trying to do, but there's just a mismatch between their skill in doing it. And I was wondering whether that's part of what you mean by agency, because so when you go back to the experiments, you ask people to press a button, but you ask them to respond to a dot on a screen. Now, when you ask the question, which are you asking them to do? Are you asking them to affect the screen or to press the button? And when you test what they've done, which are you doing? Are you testing whether they press the button or whether they change the dot on the screen? Because I think there's a difference in there. I think it's quite a subtle difference, and I can understand fully experimentally why that works and how that's, you know, I mean, that's a really good thing to do. But I think in some sense that changes what you mean by agency. Or maybe it doesn't change what you mean by agency. It changes in some sense what I understand agency to be. So I was interested in clarification of that, where the agency lies. And I think that skill example is really good, is really interesting, because the breakdown in not having the skill to do something, I would consider that slightly different from a breakdown in having the agency not to, if you want, for a better word, try to do something.
Yeah, but the question is how do you actually estimate your own agency, right? Is it the trial, or is it actually the outcome that you look at and it's just not as you predict it to be, right? So
That's what I'm not sure, and that's what I think is the difference in the way of looking at those two things. I don't have a clear answer to that, to be honest.
I want to comment.
Sorry, no, I was just saying that it was to raise that as a question.
Aaron first.
I think that there's only, in fact, I guess I'm kind of disagreeing on the idea that there are many kinds of agency. I think there's just one kind of agency, although we can look at it from lots of different angles and give it a different name depending on which angle we're looking at it from. But I think there is just one kind of agency, and it's a reinforcement learning signal. It's a reinforcement learning signal no matter whether you're talking about the relationship between the brain and the body and the world, or the relationship between humankind and the world, like global warming, right? We're in a process of trying to figure out our role in making the world warmer. That's a kind of agency as well, and it's another kind of reinforcement learning signal. If our behavior is having untoward outcomes, then we want to learn to curb that behavior. If it's having a good outcome, we want to reinforce it and do it again. That's what, for me, agency is that. That's what it's for. That's what it does, and by that token, there should just be one kind, at least for each domain. Brain, body, there should be one kind of agency. Body, world, there should be another kind.
I think that's a really important insight with which I'd like to agree, but in reinforcement learning theory, we think about the idea that you get this reinforcer, you get this signal, and then the important thing is how you use it next.
Yeah.
And in sense of agency, it seems to me there's some quite interesting questions about everything which happens up until the point where you get the reinforcement signal. So you can imagine that you would perform an action, there'd be some event, you'd have a strong experience that you caused the event, and then for one reason or another you might not end up using that to reinforce anything.
Right.
So the reinforcement learning stuff is, could be the reason, if you like, why agency has evolved, but the actual experience of agency doesn't logically require that you use agency to reinforce what you do next time. I agree that you probably
Fair
do.
enough.
I agree that you probably do, but there is an agency in the moment, even if you don't learn anything.
Yeah, so it's automatic in the sense that it provides the capacity to have that, to use the reinforcement signal. You may not always make use of it.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's always on offer.
Yeah.
Yeah, a short comment. There's like the kind of agency where you are investigating the situation you are in. Like I observed a newborn infant, actually a bit premature infant, placed in warm water. And this little guy, he used his feet very gently to feel the boundaries, not the hands, but the feet, very gently. And when he was assured of the boundaries, he was aware of the water and the interaction with the parents. So there's some capacity already in the room, of course, but also this capacity to investigate the situation. That's another kind of agency, like pressing the button to make something happen. So this kind of agency is also going on, and I believe, like you, that we start from being integrated, and then we have to learn to differentiate ourselves and like build ourselves and get skills. And that's part of the investigation, but also part, of course, the desire to make control and do something. It's a process.
So yeah,
I don't think
quick
we
comment
start
on
off
that.
being separated.
It's of course very hard to interpret what infants actually think and do. 'Cause
Yeah.
they're infants and they seldom reply when we ask them stuff. I'm not sure it's necessarily a different kind of agency than pressing a button. So you still, when you press your feet, I assume that babies have actually a better sensory information from their feet than we have. We suppress it quite a lot, at least when we're standing and walking and stuff like that. So you feel the boundaries, which is actually, you're moving your leg and you get a sensoric feedback. That's not necessarily way different from pressing a button and hearing a tone. It's still an event causing a feedback.
So, but we are also, you also mentioned the example about the tones that if you manipulate the consequence of the tone, then you feel less agency of that. So the question is again, so in that case you're in a situation with the infant that they don't really know what's going to happen when they are moving their feet around.
But uncertainty doesn't necessitate a new type of agency.
Yeah. So that suggests that there are two types of agency.
No.
Uncertain.
I said I meant that I don't think uncertainty, the fact that you can't figure out the consequences of your action doesn't necessarily imply that there are different versions of agency.
Okay.
Why would it do that? It's not. The question is whether or not you can actually argue that you feel agency of something where you cannot predict the outcome.
Yeah.
And I would argue that unless you rationalize the outcome afterwards, you actually don't. So if I toss a coin into a box and the box is closed and it's removed, I can't feel agency of the outcome whether it sets the tail, for instance, right? So claiming I have agency of the consequence of being hit, for instance, would be false. I can claim that I have an agency and control over the fact that I threw the coin into the box, but not as such. So there are certain events which are so uncertain that you can't predict them.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure it's clear cut whether or not we can argue that we have agency or sense of agency in the way I have talked about it in those examples. I think agency is learned. I don't think it's given.
Can I make a...
Could I just react to that very interesting example about the baby exploring the water tank and finding the boundaries with its feet, because it made me want to try a ridiculous philosophical argument. And the ridiculous philosophical argument would go like this. So maybe we would say that baby is exploring its environment and it's making representation of the size of the water tank and so on. But maybe actually that's in a way how what sense of agency is doing. So the baby is making a motor command to move its feet. It's getting sensory feedback that its foot has hit something. That creates the boundary of the environment. And the baby in that sense is not perceiving its world, it's constructing its world through its agency. And you then have a very radical view that we don't perceive our external world, we always construct it through our action, which I suspect some sort of deep embodiment or deep inactivist people would believe.
I belong to that.
I'm glad I'm much less radical than the average person in the room.
Once in a while.
But it just seems such a different way of thinking about what the baby's doing, that it's making the world, not perceiving it.